One description is spitting, just a gentle rain. Let's hope it holds off. The moment the Queen puts her signature on this document, it becomes law. It will be witnessed later. The Constitution is now home. A fanfare in the background, as you can hear.
Today's events have truly made this day one of the greatest days in Canada's 115-year history. 115 years after Queen Victoria signed for Canada's existence in the British North American Act, we have set another milestone in Canada's history today. Today, April 17, 1982, we have officially repatriated the Canadian Constitution from the British Parliament. We are now fully independent for Britain, except for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, who is still our monarch, though she holds no more power on Canada than being a figurehead. We are in the kitchen of Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, and this is the location where the Gang of Eight fell, and an amending formula was finally achieved. The Gang of Eight, which consisted of the premiers led by Quebec, with Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia. After many restless days and nights, with many nasty debates, Pierre Trudeau and the premiers have worked out on how to bring home the Constitution. Also, after fighting and wrestling over the ruling by the Supreme Court where it stated that the Canadian government could not go to repatriate the Constitution unilaterally, he began the process to get the provinces to agree on an amending formula that we, Canada, could regulate ourselves. The new approved Canadian Constitution was achieved by Jean Chrétien, representing the federal government as the Federal Attorney General. Roy Romanow, the Attorney General of Saskatchewan, and Roy McMurtry, the Attorney General of Ontario. Everyone gave in a little bit, but all the leaders agreed that bringing home the Constitution was the priority. The final barrier has been passed, and a majority of the provinces agreed except Quebec. I am Mr. Trudeau, who signed the Constitution along with the Queen. Welcome, Mr. Trudeau.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with all of you. The Constitution is home, and I'll later explain the role of Quebec in this Constitution and how the Constitution works.
It sure is indeed, Mr. Trudeau. What do you think bringing the Constitution home means for Canada?
This Constitution means that we, the Canadian government, are now in no way tied to the British government, and we can now take control in the way our government works. The blueprint is now in our hands to control. More importantly, Canadians now have control over how the government works, and Canadians are now in control in modifying this blueprint, no longer by the British. Our Constitution has become Canadian.
Mr. Trudeau, did you know that there have been at least several earlier tries to repatriate the Constitution, but they weren't successful?
Yes. It was between 1960 and Pearson's days around, I think,
yes.
And to around, I think, 1978. I'm just so pleased to have the honor to bring home the Constitution back to Canada.
Most importantly, how do you feel now that the repatriation process has begun?
It certainly has been a difficult 4-day conference here in Ottawa to reach this agreement. A consensus has finally been achieved, and now we can begin the process of passing the bill in the Canadian Parliament and talking to the British Parliament to begin the process. However, amid all this, it feels just so great that we have achieved this in such a short time.
Surely a very important day indeed. History students now have one more date to remember. So, Mr. Trudeau, what are the components of this Canadian Constitution, and how does it work?
Firstly, the most important part of the Constitution is the amending formula. And we call this the 750 formula. The amending formula was devised since Canada has 10 provinces, once there's a majority of the provinces having a minimum of 7 out of 10. Now, we have to acknowledge that 7 out of 10 provinces is not enough, because we do have some small provinces, like Prince Edward Island. So the combined population represented by these provinces must be at least 50% of the Canadian population at that time. For example, if I were to propose an amendment today, I would need to have 7 out of the 10 provinces, and those 7 out of the 10 provinces must be at least representing around 12,560,000 Canadians. Unfortunately, the deadlock policy that I wished for did not go through, where if a deadlock did occur, a national referendum would be held, and the people would decide if that particular constitutional amendment would go through. The second most important part is the notwithstanding clause, and this I wrestled a bit with. This is the part where the provinces can pass bills to override certain parts of the Charter. The document is entrenched within the Constitution, so it's safely protected, guaranteeing the rights of all Canadians dealing with the government. The parts of the Constitution where the provincial governments cannot override are equality rights in all aspects, lesbian, gay, men, and women. Again, the government has no right to regulate the bedrooms of Canadians. Also, mobility rights, the right to move around in and outside the country. And finally, democratic rights, the rights to vote every 5 years. And language rights, including minority language like Chinese, Polish, etc. Overall, we have had to compromise, but a consensus has been reached and it's definitely been worth it.
That is just great. Now, questions from the press?
Sir, Harvey Smith from CTV. Mr. Trudeau, what personally led you to repatriate the Constitution?
Well, one very critical event was that the Quebec referendum back in 1980. I promised to Quebecers and Canadians that if the Quebecers voted no to separation, I would get the repatriation process going. My thought was that since we are now United Canadians, not French Canadian, not English Canadian, strictly Canadian, I know that the Constitution coming home to Canada was the right thing to do at this time. Also, next.
Oh, sir. Why isn't Quebec agreed?
Mr. Levesque, who was the Premier of Quebec, wanted to have a clause in the Constitution where the provinces could override all parts of the Charter. Now, however, anybody with common sense knows that this would allow tyranny to happen in a democratic society, and we cannot allow that. This would be disastrous because the provincial governments could take away minorities' rights or democratic rights, and this would just be terrible.
Mr. Trudeau, what was the kitchen compromise?
As we know, the people involved in this were Mr. Chrétien, Mr. McMurtry, and Mr. Romanow. It happened right here, outside the meetings in this very kitchen. Anyways, Mr. Chrétien compromised to the point where they met at the middle. Since we could not have give the provinces the right to veto all parts of the Charter, we met at the middle by allowing them to override certain parts of it, while guaranteeing certain freedoms of Canadians. From this kitchen compromise, the non-withstanding clause was born. This was simply the kitchen compromise or the kitchen accord. On the next day, we have the other premiers of the Gang of Eight, except for Mr. Levesque, against this agreement. Just a quick closing remark. We have our Constitution. Our Constitution is home.